Great. Good afternoon, everybody. I know many of you have been sitting in the waiting room, so I'm going to give it just a few seconds for people to join here. That's okay. Great. The numbers are filling up here, so welcome to you all. We're expecting about 80 or 90 people on the call, so you're all very welcome on our glorious Indian summer, but alas, we are all still virtual. So my name's Suzanne Keatinge, I'm the CEO of Dóchas, and my main function just now is to remind you of all the Zoom protocols for this next hour and a half before I hand you over to the chair of Dóchas, Finola, to make some welcoming remarks. Just so that you know, this is in webinar format, so you will see all the panelists, I hope. Unfortunately, we can't see all of you listening in, but I would ask you, if you have a question or a comment, please use the Q&A function, not the chat function, the Q&A function. But everybody can see that. So I would ask if you clearly put your organization, your name should already be up there so that we know who you are. There will be time for Q&A, we hope, and if the technology allows us, we might be able to bring people in to actually ask the question themselves. If you do want to speak, please raise your hand, the technical kind of virtual raise hand as well, and we will see if the technology and the time allows for that. Look, it is our Zoom reality. We want to have a dialogue here, we want to have a conversation, but we are just going to have to manage with the technology. The other thing I know each of you know now about Zoom is that nobody wants to be on it for too long, okay? So we will be managing the time quite tightly. We do want to finish up by 4 o'clock, if not a little bit before that. If we can't get to all the questions and comments, just rest assured we are saving them and we will use them in Dóchas to inform our future conversations. Lastly, then, just to note, this is being recorded. So we will be sharing the link with all the participants, and to the many politicians and TDs that said they wanted to come today. Not everybody has made the time or has been able to, but we will be sharing this with them afterwards so that we can keep the conversations going. Lastly, please feel free to tweet about the event or some of the important messages you hear today. Grateful if you tag Dóchas at Dóchas Network and use the hashtags, hashtag Leave No One Behind, hashtag Irish Aid Works, and the most important one of all, hashtag Budget 2021. Okay. So now I will hand you over to Finola, who is the Deputy Director of Trócaire and the current Chair of Dóchas, to welcome you and introduce the session. Over to you, Finola.
Thank you, Suzanne, and welcome everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar. We're delighted to have voices from across the membership, together with members of the Dáil, the Seanad and MEPs, to have this very important conversation. I do want to extend a particular welcome to Bernard Durkin and his party colleague Emer Higgins from Fine Gael, also to John Brady, Sinn Féin Foreign Affairs spokesperson, who Dóchas was delighted to meet just last week, to Brian Ledden from the Green Party, and indeed any other members of the Committee on Foreign Affairs that have been able to join us today, and importantly their advisors. A special thanks to Noel Murphy, the clerk of the committee, who has supported Dóchas, not just with this webinar, but over a long period, and I'm sure will be our supporter into the future. As you know, we're very keen to engage with the committee when it gets up and running, and please know that Dóchas is here to support you in whatever way we can. We would like to help shape and inform policy on humanitarian development issues during the next Dáil, and we are at your service. It's a time of great disruption and challenge, as we all know, in the sector, but it's also a time of opportunity. Ireland is taking up the Security Council seat in January, and that alongside us all dealing with the dramatic impacts of COVID-19 will make for a very busy period ahead. We believe that we need to work together during that period, and that we can work together to rise to these unprecedented challenges that we're all seeing in our world today, and we're certainly seeing on the ground. At a European level, we're delighted to have MEPs with us here today. So a very warm welcome to Barry Andrews and to Frances Fitzgerald, who are on the call today. They have been very busy in Brussels, championing, among other things, issues on humanitarian action and gender equality, and we thank them for that. Thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule and your European diaries to be with us here today. And you have been great supporters of the past, and I'm sure will support us in the future as we get through this crisis. We have, as Suzanne said, a large number from across the membership join us today. We have about 90 people listening into this call. We're using the technology to be able to reach out to those further afield, and we're also delighted to have two guest speakers from East Africa and the Middle East. And I think that'll bring to life some of the issues we're talking about today. You all, I hope, have received our pre-budget submission. There are 4 asks in that, and the way we're going to work this afternoon is that we're going to have individuals who speak to those asks, and I will introduce them in due course. We all know that COVID-19 has had devastating impacts in our world. You will hear about some of that a little bit later. I will just perhaps mention 2. I suppose the first is that the Gates Foundation has said that in the last 25 weeks alone, vaccine and health coverage has been set back by about 25 years. That's a shocking statistic. We also know that the UN estimates that about 270 million people will experience acute hunger in 2020. And they're also estimating that about 12,000 people per day could die from the impacts of hunger by the end of the year. So we know that we're looking at intersecting vulnerabilities and intersecting crises. So while the epidemic may be spreading equally across the globe, we know that the impact within societies and across countries is not the same. And we hope to bring that to your attention. And the reason that we're doing this, of course, is that our message to government and to political parties is that overseas development assistance works, and it's really important to support it over this crisis and beyond. We have a very strong vision as a country, working alongside Irish Aid and government on a better world. And we really want to deliver on that. And I suppose today what we're calling for is that we look at the structural inequalities that are hampering that effort, and that we continue to support Ireland matching its global ambitions with strong financial commitments in budget 2021. We only have a few weeks to go. We know there's much domestic pressure building up, and we have to remember that maintaining the overseas development assistance budget and the promises is incredibly important at this time. Ireland is known for supporting the most vulnerable in trying times. And I think we have a great champion in Mike Ryan, who keeps reminding us from WHO that nobody is safe until everybody is safe. But it's also the right thing to do. And so before we start our panel discussion, I just want to remind you from a short video that Dóchas launched today. And please, as Suzanne says, please do tweet it, please share it. It's a video that tells us and reminds us what a proud history we have of international development. We're using this to raise awareness in the public, but also across government. So please sit back and we shall show the short video before we start the panel discussion. Thank you. Seem to have a little difficulty with sound. So hopefully we can sort that one out.
Ireland. We're a small country, a tiny island off the coast of Europe. Our story is incredible. Against the odds, we have surmounted hardships to become one of the most flourishing countries in the world. Our ancestors who experienced famine could never have imagined the peace and influence we enjoy today. We sit at global tables, influencing global decisions. We hold the longest unbroken record for peacekeeping in the world. In overcoming our own challenges as the underdog, we have a responsibility to leave no one behind. A sense of social justice is ingrained in Irish culture. In recent years, we have seen our country mature into one that faces its challenges and genuinely tries to improve the lives of everyone. We aren't perfect, but we're getting there. It is through this social justice lens that Ireland's international development organisations engage with communities around the world. But for the first time in living memory, the whole world is simultaneously facing the global COVID-19 and climate crises. Ireland's international development organisations are some of the most welcomed agencies in the world, expert at saving lives and supporting the rebuilding of communities when famine, conflict or hunger strike. We are a small country, but our footprint around the world is enormous. As COVID-19 threatens to push hundreds of millions of the world's poorest people into further poverty, we need to be able to continue working hard together with and for the world's most vulnerable communities. And our work has never been more important than it is now. Let's keep leading the world in social justice. Support Ireland's overseas aid budget. Irish Aid Works. Post your support on social media using the hashtag #IrishAidWorks and tag your local TD.
You're on mute. Sorry, Finola, you're just on mute there.
Oh, sorry about that. So just to say that I hope you share this as widely as you can with colleagues, with friends, with family, and please do use the hashtag there. It talks about the importance of our work, and I think it's really important to get the public behind us. So no, I'm delighted to start our panel discussion. I'm going to start by inviting the two colleagues who are working furthest afield at the moment to speak about the reality of dealing with COVID-19 and how Ireland has responded to maintain investment in ODA funding, why we need to continue that investment and the impact of the work that we're doing on the ground. So first up is Colin Lee, who's the Director for Plan International in the Middle East. Colin is Irish, but he's been based in Beirut since 2007 and indeed brings lots of expertise from the region. As we all know, Beirut and Lebanon has been dealing with many crises, including COVID, and I'm sure we'll be very interested to hear what he has to say to us. And next up, we'll also have Stephen Omollo, who's World Vision's Regional Director for Eastern Africa, and he's based in Nairobi, Kenya, but also lives in Ireland. Before that, Stephen has 25 years experience of humanitarian development experience, including with the Red Cross and Red Crescent Movement, the Commonwealth Secretariat, the Africa Union and UNDP. So rich experiences from both of them, and I'll hand the floor over to Colin first, please.
Thanks very much, Finola. Yeah, and thank you very much for letting me talk today and specifically talk about Lebanon and the Middle East at this critical time. I think we've traditionally used, as a nation, we've used terms such as the Phoenix Rising, Bob Fiske's term, pity the nation, and we've used the term resilience so often for the Lebanese and for Lebanon in general over the past 30 odd years. I think this time it's very different. We have three major sectors that have held Lebanon up for many, many years: education, health, and the banking system, and all are gone or are going very, very quickly. Education, we've seen teachers basically leave the country, parents not able to pay fees, the negative impact of the Syrian refugee population in Lebanon, which have produced second and third shifts in the public schools. In the health sector, we've seen a devaluation of the currency whereby medication and equipment is no longer possible to import into the country. So once the sort of go-to country in the Middle East from the Gulf states and others is no longer. And finally, banking, as the international financial sector went bang in 2008 and 9, Lebanon stood tall. Little did we know at the time that we were sitting on a major Ponzi scheme. And we, this was at a time when we had up to $9 billion coming in a year in remittances from the Lebanese diaspora. So times have changed. We're still hosting 1.5 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon. We've been doing that for a decade. And this is the highest population of refugees per capita globally. So that basically, what does that look like? That looks like putting 1.5 million refugees into Munster tomorrow morning, telling them they can't work, telling them they can't live in camps together and treating them as third-class citizens. There was a banner last summer in the family village where we go up to often at weekends that was in Arabic that stated very clearly, this was pre-COVID, that stated Syrians were not allowed out after 7 p.m. That'll give you an idea of the way they're treated in Lebanon. Syrian refugees in general, as we know, not just in Lebanon, elsewhere in Jordan and other places, aren't going home. There's nothing to go home to. And until the conflict and the war is over in Syria, and until the country is carved up, that even then it probably won't be a reality. We talk about Lebanon as a failing state when actually by criteria and definition it is a failed state, and it is inching closer all the time to what Yemen, Syria, Libya and particularly Iraq is like, with the sectarian divide in that country, and Lebanon is heading down that road very, very quickly. We've had a free-for-all, and that's what I call it, a free-for-all in Lebanon for 30 years. What's happened in the port area of Beirut on August 4th was a microcosm, or is a microcosm, if you like, of the Lebanese state and the failures in there of corruption, mismanagement, and gross negligence. And they're terms that are associated with many of the countries that we work in, all of us. But they're terms that I would never have used a year ago because I would have been worried I'd been kicked out of the country. So, you know, we're dealing with a very different time. And the genie is very much out of the bottle here in Lebanon, and is different, changing right across the region in the Middle East. Everybody's been impacted by the massive economic downturn in Lebanon. We have the middle class big time hit over the last year or so. We have a brain drain of thousands of professionals leaving the country on a daily basis, clutching flags as they leave the country, and saying that they're leaving because they want a future for their kids and they want their kids to have an education. And what they're taking behind, or what they're leaving behind, is very little. So, you know, these are very, very dark days indeed for us. I'll give you an example just in terms of middle class, and they're not falling into poverty overnight, but they are slipping down the pecking order very, very quickly. My mother-in-law's is a 74-year-old lawyer who's built up a substantial practice in Beirut over a number of years. Her house was completely destroyed in the explosion, nothing left of it. It took us 3 days to find the safe, to get the deeds of the property out of the safe, and to find all the paperwork. There's nothing left. There's no insurance policy. There's no there's no pact of any sort of reimbursement of anything. And all her money, or any money that she has, is in the bank, which is gone as well. So this is a new wave that's hitting the middle class. I tell my own kids who go to a private school in Beirut that they're very lucky to go there. Last year, pre-COVID, we had 3,500 children enrolled in that school. This year, 2,500 children. So 1,000 have dropped out simply because they can't afford to pay the fees, or because their parents have taken them overseas to go to other places. So there's a big change going on here. When we talk about COVID-19, and I've been following the stats in Ireland, for a similar population in Lebanon, we registered just over 1,000 positive cases last night in one day, 11 deaths and 1,000 cases. It's spreading rapidly, community spread throughout the country. The health sector, the health system is completely overwhelmed, it can't cope. And that's with very, very limited testing. We're about 7,000 or 7,500 tests on a daily basis. It shows you how desperate people are to actually earn a living and get out there. I've got to mention, obviously, the impact on girls, particularly on education and early child marriage, should I say, from this. We have a series of laws in Lebanon where a child, religious laws, where a child as young as 9 can get married. You know, we use the term child marriage when actually it's nothing short of child abuse. And whilst we can do things and influence laws and change things and force things and push things like that, at the end of the day, livelihoods and economics is what counts. It's what prevents people from falling into that real level of vulnerability. And that's really what is important at the end of the day. Just in terms of a location of as a country, and I mentioned Lebanon as a failed state, we're 160 miles off the Cypriot coast. That's a very short distance towards the European Union, and Barry, I think, will know what I'm talking about here. We had 10 people last week, didn't make the international media, 6 who drowned straight away, 4 who went missing after 8 days at sea. 2 of those people, two of those Lebanese citizens were toddlers. So the boats are starting by the spring, summer of next year, it would be very likely that the new route into Europe is going to be from Lebanon. It's a very strong chance. The smugglers are getting organized. People are selling furniture and whatever they can to make that route to head up towards Europe, because they've had enough in the country and they can no longer survive. I'm going to finish on a sort of positive note, if it's possible. I think as a nation, we should be extremely proud of the fact that we've opened a fully fledged embassy in Jordan. We've got one of the most proactive ambassadors who I've ever met, certainly involved on the humanitarian side and involved in all sorts of different things. But I think, Finola, as you said at the beginning, we have a strong vision as a country. And I think it's time to up the tempo on Lebanon. We've been below par for a long time here, both in terms of our footprint in the country, in terms of our funding. I know there's always reasons why we can't do something, but let's find a reason why we can. Lebanon needs assistance. As I said, it's 160 miles off the Cypriot coast. There are bad days coming. We had the Cypriot authorities in Beirut last week appealing to the caretaker government, because we still don't have one, to do everything they can to stop this from happening. But at the end of the day, it's livelihoods, it's investment, and that's what it's going to take. It's going to take a huge effort. And finally, just on another point there, in your short clip, I saw an Irish soldier, and I would guess that the picture was taken in Tibneen a number of years ago. We have a very proud history with this country. And as I said, it really is time that we stepped up a bit more than we have in the past. Thanks very much.
Great, and I would now like to ask Stephen to give his input, please.
Thank you very much, Finola, and truly humbled to be invited to this panel. I like that video really very much, because it reminded me as a beneficiary of Irish aid for many years. And that has taught me one thing over the past few years that I've worked in the international humanitarian field and development, listening to the voices of children. And so as part of this, we embark on working with children and listening to the stories from children in this region, in East Africa region. And so I met a 13-year-old girl from South Sudan who is in a refugee camp in northern Uganda. And we asked the children, what do you think about the world today? You know, and I pose this question to you and ask you, what do you think is in the forefront in the minds of children today in the world? And remarkable, really, the answer from this 13-year-old from South Sudan. Here is what she told me. I feel the world is over. I'm thinking about the future. But what is the future? What will happen in future? Can I even feel better after? Maybe not. Can I work again? Maybe not. But I'm truly saddened. I'm sad, and I'm afraid of the future. This is the answer for a 13-year-old girl that is living in the most atrocious conditions in the refugee camp in northern Uganda. Well, that future has been destroyed. That future, as we speak today, the COVID-19 has undermined all the gains most of the gains from the SDGs. Well, according to the reports that we hear and working in the field, we see remarkably how those SDG gains are being undermined. Some people have said 10 years we've lost, others are probably saying 15 years. But what for sure is there today is that the poverty gap is growing and growing with no signs of bridging the gap. But then this child, the 13-year-old that I was speaking with, does not feel better because she is amongst the millions of children who remain in refugee camps, in the IDP camps, internally displaced camps. Millions of children today are subjected to abuse, their rights infringed, no nutrition. Millions of children do not even access vaccinations for some of the most preventable diseases today. Malaria and TB and HIV/AIDS still prevalent part of the world. Now, COVID-19 has just exacerbated the whole scenario. The fragility that we confront with us today, and most of you know that East Africa was infested with locusts. Still, we have locusts in the region, locust invasion. And the outcome of that is very clear: famine, food insecurity. But then, so today we struggle, of course, because of COVID-19. And most children in this part of the world do not have access to nutrition, do not have access to education today because most of the schools are shut down, of course, but that happens all over the world. But then no access to healthcare. But this child also, Finola, tells me that she is saddened because of the protracted conflicts in South Sudan. I mean, this region is riddled with conflicts, protracted conflicts, South Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia, name it, Uganda, northern part. And so millions of children and millions of children live in those kind of atrocious conditions today in this part of the world. But then she is also saddened because she sees that most of their family members have lost jobs, you know, as a result of the socioeconomic impact of COVID. Most of the family members have lost their livelihoods. And we are therefore staring at a very bleak future indeed, Finola, in this part of the region. And that is the reason that I'm truly convinced, and as somebody who has witnessed the Irish aid at work in the field for many years, I particularly want to give examples of Tanzania and Ethiopia and Uganda, where Irish aid has made tremendous impact in humanitarian development work. Today is the time that we must not look back. Today is the time that we must accompany that 13-year-old child. Today is the day that we must accompany all those children in the world and not leave them behind. Because if we leave them behind, then truly, most of them, as we see today in this field, they die. That is really the sad truth, they die. And therefore, my call today, Finola and colleagues, is to protect, a call to protect the ODA and enjoin the other countries like Australia and many others that I was speaking to Australia the other day. And the time to act is now. And I dare say really that unless we act today, then this pandemic and many other calamities that we're going to confront with in future is going to destroy us. And therefore, I just want to make two more comments here, that in this time of risk and uncertainty, that is where we are today, risk and uncertainty, it is the most important time in our lifetime today that collectively, as international community, we must come together. Now, you mentioned definitely at the beginning that Ireland is taking its seat at the Security Council in 2021. Congratulations, a big lift for Ireland and for the world in general, really, because of what Ireland occupying that seat will manage to do in terms of advocacy, in terms of positioning, in terms of being the voice of the voiceless, and Ireland does that so well. But then this is the most important point for me now, that powerful voice that you carry to the Security Council is a voice for all of us. And therefore, I just want to encourage you that as we look into this matter of protecting funds to ODA and support to the field, that to remain cognizant that really the future of these children lie in our hands today. Now, I know it is not only this, and it's important to reiterate that we need to work collectively. So the strategic, what does ODA bring? The investment, ODA investment, what does it bring in my viewpoint? It brings a strategic and a catalytic role in the SDGs and more broadly beyond, especially in the less developed countries like where I am here today in East Africa region. It can meet the immediate pressing needs and leverage additional financing, such as through investing in innovative development solutions, but also working with the civil society, working with the different government institutions, working with the local organizations. And this is what is important. Local organizations, but even those organizations that are working in Ireland today have a lot of influence in this part of the world. And therefore, how do we encourage local institutions to partner with the international community so that they are stronger because of the local knowledge that they have and because of the ownership? So but the growing trend today, Finola, is that international cooperation amongst developing countries and promote this South-to-South model. But that is one part that Ireland also plays very, very strongly. And I believe that the voice of Ireland in promoting this South-to-South dialogue and modus operandi is going to be very important in enhancing financing beyond ODA. And therefore, how do you leverage on that? And therefore, I just want to end in saying this, that today, COVID-19 has found us already fragile. COVID-19 has found us that economies that are struggling with healthcare, economies that are struggling with education, economies that are riddled with democratic challenges, economies that are impacted with climate change, economies that today, as I am speaking to you, most of the government in this part of the region are struggling to support livelihoods. And therefore, my call really, and this is a clarion call, is that how do we ensure that as we build better as a result of COVID-19 and the impacts of COVID-19, that we remain attuned to the needs of the communities on the ground. And that as we provide funding and the different funding mechanisms to the government, that we are cognizant of the role that the civil society and the NGOs play in providing this support most directly to the communities that are in need. And thank you so much, Odia, because this has been a great opportunity for us to accompany and to work in this field. And we continue to do so, knowing very well that those funds are protected for the benefit of the communities most in need. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And thank you, Colin, as well. I mean, I think we have very vivid pictures from both of you of fragility and survival in those settings. I'm going to turn now to Anne O'Mahony. Anne is the Director of International Programmes and Concern Worldwide, a seasoned humanitarian who has spent her working career in Concern in very many settings, and she's an incredible ambassador for the sector. Anne is going to highlight the huge urgency around humanitarian assistance, not only to cope with COVID-19, but the many conflicts and other shocks that are raging across the world as this pandemic hit. So Anne, over to you, please.
Thanks very much, Finola, and thanks very much to Colin and Stephen for your powerful presentations. And I think it sits very well with, I suppose, what we're seeing in the various places that we work. We began 2020 with unprecedented levels of humanitarian need. We looked at ongoing conflicts, we looked at climate events, we were planning for how to deal with displacement and with refugees. And that was the ongoing caseload. And then COVID hit in February, March and April. And it has completely changed the way we work in terms of access, in terms of travel. It has complicated a huge part of the type of work that we do in working with people on the front line. We have had people working constantly since the beginning of the year without being able to take breaks because they can't move within their countries of operation. And I suppose we are seeing that COVID is affecting not just people from a health perspective, but more especially, I think, from an economic perspective. The people that we work with, if they don't themselves work, they won't eat. They need a daily income. They need daily access to the food and water that enables them to survive. And I suppose what we are seeing now is that 8.9% of the world's population are currently hungry. But farmers have enough food, or have enough capacity to produce food for 10 billion. So it's not a failure of the farming system, it's much more a failure of distribution, of access, of ability to get food to those most in need. And when you look at the various things that hit the people that we work with, when you look at things like climate change, when you look at things like conflict, when you look at everything else that the people we work with have had to put up with, the common denominator in all of this is poverty. The people who are affected by these changes, by conflict, by climate, are the poor. By COVID, they are the poor of the world, and they're the ones that are most affected at every single little thing that comes in to hit them. We look at countries like the Yemen, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, like Afghanistan, where they're all hit by both conflict, climate change, and now the COVID pandemic, which is affecting their economic agility such as it is. We look at places like the Central African Republic, where over 50% of the population are now acutely food insecure. And that's not going to change in the short term. And I suppose one of the things that we talk about is the fact that there are loads of statistics. We talk about millions of people affected. We talk about 70 million people who have had to flee their homes in the last couple of years, who are living as refugees and as displaced populations. But behind every single one of those multiples of millions are individuals people who are struggling to survive, individual mothers and fathers who are beating themselves up because they can't put enough food into the mouths of their children. And those are the people that we deal with every day of the week. Those are the people that we want to support. Those are the people that we want to help. Irish Aid has done a huge amount in terms of working with all of us as NGOs to support us to get to the people directly on the front line that we work with. And I suppose we're very proud of Irish Aid's record. We're very proud of Ireland's record overseas. And we are very proud to be part of continuing to roll out that really record of excellence. Aid does work. We have seen improvements in people's lives. We have seen sustained improvements in people's lives in the countries that we work with. What we try to do, I suppose, is build that resilience. It is much more cost effective to build resilience and to prevent emergency interventions than it is to actually mount an emergency intervention itself. And I think some really brilliant statisticians have worked out that the cost differential is about 7 times. So it's 7 times cheaper to prevent than it is to treat. And that's something that we do need to keep in mind when we're thinking about aid budgets, when we're thinking about value for money, and when we're thinking about aid effectiveness. It does work. It is cheaper to prevent than it is to address a crisis. Having said that, at the moment, we're dealing with floods across so many of our different countries. We're dealing with floods in Somalia, in Darfur, in Sudan. We're dealing with floods in Chad. In Bangladesh, of course, we've had at least 3 typhoons that have affected North Korea over the last month or 2. And behind all of these, again, are the people that struggle to survive. Colin talked about the people who were struggling to survive the bomb blast in Lebanon. That is one event of many that are affecting people who are most in need. It is a privilege, I think, to be talking to this group of people today. For me, it has been a privilege to work in so many different countries around the world, to be at the coalface, to live the experience that people are working through. I think it's also important for new people coming on to the Foreign Affairs Committee actually to get out and visit. And maybe when this COVID crisis has passed, there will be much greater opportunities to visit. And I think we would be delighted to invite you to come and visit, to come and experience with us, to come and look at what people are going through to survive. And more importantly, to look at what we as a collective and individually can do to help. And I cannot stress enough the importance it is of the aid budget overseas and how it can help and how it can make a difference. So with that in mind, I will hand back to Finola for the rest of this meeting, and happy to take questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, and thanks for that picture of complexity, but also individuals behind that and what we can do to really change their lives and have an impact with good use of aid. I'm going to hand over now to Louise, and Louise Finnan is Dóchas' head of policy, and she's been very much behind this campaign and the policy documents that support it. And Louise will speak to our third ask in our pre-budget submission. That's around the need to see more determined action to deliver on Ireland's international development aid policy. So Louise, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone who's listening in today. And thank you to the previous speakers, extremely powerful. I will keep my intervention short. It's a lot drier and less interesting than your interventions, but thank you. So really, this is really just to talk a little bit about and to give a very short intro and brief to Irish Aid's new international, or the Irish government's new international development policy, A Better World, which was launched last year in April. Really, it's an ambitious statement of intent to contribute to creating a better, fairer, more peaceful and sustainable world. It's important to remember for any of our Oireachtas colleagues listening that a 2018 report reviewing Irish aid by the then Joint Committee on Foreign Affairs, Trade and Defence helped shape and influence this new policy. So you have a big role to play here. As our previous speakers have clearly demonstrated, development cooperation and humanitarian action is needed now more than ever. The OECD DAC's peer review of Ireland's aid programme was published earlier this year. It praised once again the high quality of Ireland's aid programme. It reiterated the importance of focusing on reaching the furthest behind first, meeting climate targets and promoting respect for human rights and dignity. It is good to see now that we are seeing clear signals of intent to deliver on the climate targets with the establishment of the new climate unit in the Department of Foreign Affairs, which will have a focus on climate diplomacy. which is fantastic, and we're looking forward to seeing what that will achieve. But for today, there are 4 areas that I would briefly highlight, and they're reflected in the OECD DAC peer review. So the first is policy coherence to deliver sustainable development. This remains the vital missing link if Ireland is to deliver on its promises and leaving no one behind and reaching the furthest behind first. There has not yet been a cross-government agreement on specific policy areas where coherence needs to be enhanced, including in relation to tax policy and business and human rights. We need to see a clear mechanism which can be put in place to achieve policy coherence. This must include setting clear targets that will ensure the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. It's encouraging to hear that Dáil committees will now have a mandate to examine the implementation of the SDGs. We look forward to hearing more about what this means and understanding how you can do it, and please know we are here to support you in that. Secondly, there is a need for greater prioritisation within a better world. COVID-19 has brought into sharp focus the need to strengthen our response to addressing inequalities and to be forensic and determined in our approach. Civil society remains a critical partner to addressing these inequalities, I think, as our previous speakers have demonstrated. And support for independent development actors remains critical to the success of Irish aid, particularly if it is to scale up its programme and adapt to the rapidly changing context both at home and abroad. Thirdly, we know that support for international development rests on the ability of all of us as development actors to engage the public in conversations about the relevance and importance of overseas aid. We hope that everyone listening today will support and get behind our campaign. We hope you liked the video. We hope you share it. We hope you share it with your friends, your family, your colleagues, tag your TDs, your ministers. We should be proud. We should be proud of what we have achieved as a community and as a country. But I think we have the ability to do much more, and we know that. And finally, briefly, if Ireland is to continue to maintain and build its strength as a world leader in development and indeed international cooperation, now is the time to step up and grasp the opportunity to play a much needed leadership role on the European and global stage. There has never been a more important time. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. And there never has been a more important time is a very good way to end that. I'm going to hand over, thank you very much. I'm going to hand over now to Maeve Bateman. And Maeve is the Director of Financial Justice Ireland, and she's been lobbying hard to raise the importance of debt suspension at this time. It is something I think that we've been grappling with for many years, but has really come to the fore again since the advent of COVID-19. And it seems absolutely a crazy system where you have poor countries paying back more in debt repayments than they have coming in as aid. So Maeve, you might speak to us on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Finola. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the role that debt and debt cancellation can have to play in responding to the COVID-19 crisis. So I think the first thing to note is over the last few years, we've seen a growing debt crisis in the global south before this even started. And it's something that a number of people have been very concerned about. But that situation has worsened substantially since COVID-19 has hit, and it's really been exacerbated by that. We've seen a fall in commodity prices, we've seen an increase in future borrowing costs for countries in the global south, and we've seen the largest ever capital outflow from developing countries. So set against this context, we're seeing government revenues falling as a result. We're seeing governments in the global south having to face increasing debt repayments, and all at a time when they need to expand their healthcare and they need to increase their social protection payments in response to the crisis that we're all in. So debt vulnerabilities in general really affect a country's capacity to deal with emergency challenges. So as an increasing portion of public budgets are used to service external debt, there's simply fewer resources available to respond to the crisis. And so we know, for example, countries like Kenya, Ghana and the Gambia are currently spending 3 times more on debt repayments than on their healthcare systems, which is quite astonishing. And I think it's also worth noting when we think about our response to this, that some of the debt cancellation that was announced kind of early on after the crisis happened was actually cancellation that included relief that was granted in response to the Ebola crisis. So this kind of shows that the sort of systemic nature of our debt, that if we respond to crises with loans, not aid, we end up just building up this debt burden and restricting the ongoing ability of countries to deal with these crises. Now, in response to COVID-19, the IMF, World Bank, the Paris Club, they've all announced a number of debt-related suspensions, but we simply believe these are insufficient. We were part of a group of NGOs, and particularly Dóchas, who've been engaging with the Minister for Finance on this, and we are happy to note that the department has remained very engaged on this. A lot of effort's gone into analysing these issues, and Ireland has expressed ongoing support for enhancing debt management and debt sustainability protocols. But we believe that the multilateral organisations, the measures announced today are inadequate, and Ireland has a really key role to play strengthening the global response on these issues. To date, if you look at the IMF, debts to be cancelled relate to only 1% of debt payments owed to the IMF this year. So it's a really small amount. Some other creditors have announced suspensions structured in such a way that they risk increasing debt burdens from 2021 onwards for low and middle income countries. And the $64 billion package that's been announced by the IMF and World Bank of relief is made up overwhelmingly of loans, which will ultimately just add to the debt burdens of already heavily indebted low income countries. So I think this really highlights the importance of aid, the importance of high quality aid. As long as aid remains insufficient, low-income countries remain at the mercy of private lenders who are globally entirely unaccountable. So that this is one of the key reasons why Ireland's aid budget really needs to be fully protected in the next budget, and the importance of that. If you look at the recent report of the UN independent expert on the effects of foreign debt, which looked at the COVID response, it really highlighted the need to address debt crises and the debt situation we're in currently as quickly as possible, because there's a real fear of a widespread debt crisis. And part of those recommendations include a much more comprehensive debt standstill for all countries with high debt burden that have been affected by the pandemic. And crucially, it highlights the need to just go beyond the simple fact of dealing with the current debts, but to create a situation where we can address future debt problems as they come up. So, for example, Ireland has traditionally been opposed to the establishment of a UN-based global sovereign debt workout mechanism. And we and many in the international debt movement have been saying for years, without such a mechanism, there is no sustainable, fair path out of debt for low-income countries affected by global or by COVID-19. And going forward, these are many of the same countries who are climate affected, who are seeing their capacity to reduce, to cope with climate events, and also to invest in mitigation and adaptation is being reduced by these debt burdens as well. So I guess to not go on for too long, I know in October we're seeing the annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank. Ireland has a really strong international reputation with our aid and in these international fora. And we think this is a really key moment for us to speak to this, to actually say, to support the other countries calling for a coordinated cancellation of all bilateral, multilateral and private sovereign debt repayments that are due in 2020 and 21 from low and middle income countries. Ultimately, this debt burden, it's affecting the health response, it's affecting the response to people who've been economically devastated by this. I think the previous speakers have all outlined really clearly the wide-ranging effects that we're seeing in countries. And I think that the cancellation of these debts, the adoption of sufficient grant-based aid, and the establishment of a UN-based sovereign debt workout mechanism are kind of the key steps that we need going forward to ensure that countries who are in debt crisis are able to find a way out and to support all the individuals living in these countries. So I'll hand over there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Maeve, and indeed to all of our panelists for a great kind of array of kind of comments and giving us a sense of what this feels like. Certainly what I'm hearing is that need to kind of up the tempo, to act now, But at the same time, we're also hearing like Irish aid does work, and that's why to maintain Ireland's commitment on ODA in budget 2021 is more important than ever. And our panelists also reminded us that this isn't just about money. It is about voice. It is about promoting South-South dialogue and many more things. And that's why it is important to so many of us here on the call. But it is now time for you to ask any questions or have any comments. Please kind of put them in the Q&A chat and put your name and organization. Whilst I wait for you all to stream and to fill that question box, I'm going to turn to you, Barry, if that's okay, for any reflections and comments from what you've heard this afternoon.
Yeah, thanks, Suzanne, and thanks very much for the opportunity. I'm currently working on the Development Committee as a substitute on the Development Committee, but obviously with my background, I'm very interested in the subject. So just to respond to Colin, first of all, say hello to Colin. I haven't seen you in a long time, and it's very distressing to hear what's happening in Lebanon, but a very eye-opening to talk about the new route to into the EU, which I had not heard of before, and in terms of the danger that people are embarking upon. It really is a stark reminder to all of us. And next Wednesday, the European Commission will launch its Migration and Asylum Pact, which will be a very interesting read for all of us. We'll be looking out for whether the Dublin Convention will be abolished altogether, whether search and rescue will be part of that, whether the returns, what are the circumstances in which returns will happen. Stephen's point about protecting ODA, I think that's really something that we all share in common, and a very interesting story about this child from South Sudan in Uganda, who's, I really hoped, Stephen, that your story would be that the child is full of hope and optimism, but it's quite grim and bleak to hear that the opposite. But it is a strong testimony from a beneficiary of ODA. And hello as well, nice to see you after a while. And it's interesting you mentioned resilience, and the current German presidency of the European Council are emphasizing what they're calling anticipatory humanitarian action. So that sounds to me like resilience or a disaster risk reduction or any other of the reiterations of this idea. But it is central to the German presidency. It is a priority of the German presidency. And one couldn't imagine a humanitarian problem that is more anticipated than the one all of the speakers have referred to this afternoon, which is not only the health crisis, but also the secondary and downstream impacts of the health crisis and livelihoods and on so many other aspects of human development. I think that you know, Louise's comment about the OECD DAC review and the general strength of the Irish ODA, I think we can't ignore completely the very low level of ODA at 0.31%. I think it was in 2018. Now I know there's net increases, and that's to be welcomed. But I mean, when you think about where the European Union budget is, there was a proposal from the Commission that was brought down for the new mechanism in the EU budget to just 10 billion euro from a proposal of around 15 billion euro, and the humanitarian top-up was abolished. And you layer upon that the abolition of DFID and possible reductions in the UK aid, backsliding in the US, and you say, well, if we're going to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals or anything like it, there's a gap of about $2.5 trillion. So yes, Suzanne, it's not all about money, but by God, it's an awful lot to do with it. And just to final thing on Maeve's contribution was anything but dry, because debt cancellation and debt sustainability is critical. And I'll just finish on two files that I'm working on. One is due diligence, which is around the idea that companies need to have regard to human rights, environmental considerations, and employment in their supply chains, and that has to be part of the way that they conduct their business. And it is very relevant, I think, in this area. and you know, so it'll be interesting to hear what your views are. But I'm also working on a file on aid effectiveness, and I think when we're talking about aid effectiveness, we also have to talk about debt sustainability. These two things are related to each other. So the one last area I wanted to mention to you in terms of the files that I am working on is on sustainable corporate governance, which is again how the European Union is going to perhaps develop new regulations for the type of directors' duties that currently exist, and say to companies, well, if the purpose of your company is not merely to make profit, then that should be reflected in the way that you run your company, the duties that directors have, the way in which your board is composed, the skills that are represented. So there's a very interesting legislative program going on over here. With the crisis that's going on now, it might seem all a bit vague and obtuse, but I think it will be relevant further down the line. It seems to be the nature of legislation here in the EU. Its impact is felt maybe 3 or 4 years down the line. So I hope that, Suzanne, is a fair response, and I'll be happy to answer any more questions later on.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. That's great and good to really put it out there. We're probably far too polite when you look at ODA levels in Ireland right now. Just to remind us all, we are at 0.31% and have been there for quite a while. But again, in our pre-budget submission, if there's one thing we're wanting to say, it's also about the quantity of funding this year, which is all important. We cannot afford to see it go down. Now, I'm in the, I don't know, the lucky position, I think, that there are no questions right now. So I am going to come in and ask questions myself, beware. But what I thought we might do is, whilst we've got a really good sense of what's going on, let's also remember that as Irish NGOs, there's been a lot of innovation and a lot of positive things going on to kind of adapt and to manage the worst effects of this crisis. So I perhaps kind of ask with that in mind, and maybe first to turn to you, Anne, if that's okay. I think you rightly said we have to be proud of Irish Aid and the Irish Aid programme. And right from the beginning of COVID, they've journeyed with us, they've listened to us, they've been very, very flexible. But if there's one thing you would ask them to do right now that would really make that difference on the ground and to help you do even more than you're doing in Concern, what might it be?
I think you're right, Suzanne. I think Irish Aid has been on a journey with us and has showed great flexibility. And, you know, they kept on coming back to us to say, what do you need to change? What do you need to change to enable you to cope with COVID? And we were able to do, with their approval, do quite a lot of budget pivoting as was required at the time. But I suppose where we have moved budgets, the problem that was designed for those budgets to address has not gone away. And as I had mentioned earlier, the needs have increased. And, you know, while we do understand, and I think we do need to emphasize this, we do understand that there are huge needs in Ireland in terms of balancing budgets, and I think the government has a big task to do. We are part of a global village. We have responsibilities, I think, as one of the richest countries in the world, because we are, it doesn't matter what statistics you look at, we are one of the richest countries in the world. And therefore, with that great wealth comes responsibility. And it's about taking that responsibility to look at how we continue to invest in overseas programming. You know, I had mentioned resilience earlier on, and it certainly does work, and it certainly does reduce the burden on very vulnerable communities if we're able to build that resilience. For Irish Aid, or for the government, I would say, invest in your NGOs. We are the people that are out there at the front line. We, the NGOs, are very much working in areas where very few others are. And we're almost the flag bearers at this point in time for the Irish government in terms of where we work. We work in countries where there is no Irish government presence, and we continue to push the boundaries. So come on the journey and stay on this journey with us.
Thanks, Anne, and really good. I mean, we've heard even in Ireland this thing about kind of frontline workers and you know, just how much people are doing. And in many ways, I'd say, you know, the Irish NGOs are the global frontline workers and really, as you say, doing incredible work. I'm going to turn now, if you don't mind, to you, Colin. You had that wonderful idea. Imagine if you were in Munster today and we put 1.5 million refugees there and said they can't work and they had to stay in camps, just get on with it. A very kind of visual and stark portrait there. But maybe you can give us a sense, so from Plan and from your work, what positive responses have agencies been doing on the ground to try and at least mitigate some of the worst impacts for refugees in the Middle East more generally?
Yeah, thanks, Suzanne. You know, there's been quite a lot. I think the Middle East hosts has 6% of the global population, yet we have the biggest refugee and IDP population globally. So there, you know, we've got a very youthful population across the MENA. Out of 22 countries, 11 of them are in conflict. That's huge, and that's just spreading all the time. I mentioned Lebanon as a failed state, and the proximity to Europe and to the Greek islands and to Cyprus and all that sort of stuff. So, you know, we have to look at our programming in tandem. You know, this is an old argument and an old discussion that we've had, and many people on this call will remember a gentleman called Ross Mountain from New Zealand, from Timor days. He was in Lebanon a number of years ago, and his simple approach to this was, we cannot view individual programs for refugees. It has to be social cohesion. We have to work hand in hand. And it's no good in trying to buy off, whether it's the Lebanese population or the Jordanian host population, with a playground here and there. It has to be a little bit more than that. And it hasn't been to date. And I think as humanitarian actors, you know, globally and in the Middle East in general, we haven't performed ourselves as that. We need to do a lot more, but we need that journey. And as Anne mentioned, we need the donors to come with us, and we need particularly Irish Aid to come with us on this. So I think seeing, you know, looking at things in tandem, looking at things with refugee and host population. And one ask, and I'll reiterate it again today, is Lebanon in particular, it's Venezuela with guns, and we have a lot of them in this country. I mean, this place is armed and ready to go. We've heard phrases like tinderbox for a long time. The impact here of another civil war here will reach Europe, and it will have monstrous sort of consequences. And you know, finally, when we do look at ODA and when we do look at ways of fixing things and making things happen, you know, civil registration and vital statistics, Plan has been involved with and have tried to be involved with a little bit more in the Middle East. We don't know who we have in the country. You know, there has been no census in Lebanon since 1932, and there's a reason for that. So, you know, we need to get those things right. We need to support departments where we can in that sort of thing. But in general, I think we need to look at host populations when we look at refugees and not create that sort of divide, because many of the refugees, as we know, when they move out of their countries, and particularly out of Syria, into places like Lebanon, they shelter and they live in the villages that are the most vulnerable, and they put a huge level of pressure. And that example of Munster is the only way to look at it, because people can't work. They are treated like third-class citizens, and they have absolutely no rights. So, you know, in tandem and showing value for, again, value for money as well in joint programming. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Colin. And I think you do touch on something that has been a thread here, is that when we look at the SDGs, what's so valuable about it as a framework is that it's not just looking at one single issue. It's trying to see the connections between issues, but it also stresses that need for partnership. It's not one group of stakeholders against another. I might then turn to you, Stephen, if that's okay. I know in your input you did mention and stress the SDGs, which is great. And of course, Kenya partnered with Ireland in the development of them. I'm curious to know, though, that on the ground and in Kenya, do people still talk about the SDGs? Is there still energy there? And how do you think we can re-energize the SDGs as a pathway to manage a lot of the challenges that we face? Just unmute there, Stephen. Yeah. Yeah,
thank you very much for that. And it's a great question, really. I mean, I I didn't mention this, but I'll say it now, that even as World Vision and what we do with the children, our work with the children here, we've seen great opportunities as well from COVID-19. I know that we have been painting a bleak picture about, you know, and rightfully so, that is consequence of COVID-19, but the opportunities are there. And I'll give you an example based on the SDGs. I see, especially in the area of education. First of all, access has been difficult because most of the schools have been shut down. So we all know that. But I think the opportunity there is that most of the less privileged, you know, societies and children from less privileged, you know, backgrounds are now able to access education through the ICT, through technology. And so even in those schools that were in the remotest parts of the countries now, you see students now and the children accessing that education from the online platform. And I think that has been great, really, that even though the education has been disrupted, and as I said earlier, that if you look at one of the great, one of the gains that we've actually lost, if I must say that, is in the area of education and health. But the opportunity therefore, for me, is that the adaptability in technology, ICT, especially in education, is absolutely critical. And I think that ensures equity and inclusion. So the big thing there for me is equity and inclusion. How do we ensure that in this pandemic world that we don't lose focus of that? And I see that more in the area of education. Now, are we there yet? I don't think so. I think we are still way behind that. But there is those meaningful steps that have been taken to ensure that adaptability in technology is helping in the area of education, as an example.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Look, now there are questions now in the Q&A, and I'm just going to turn to one of them there. Something that hasn't really come up yet is the importance of public engagement. This question from Mela Cusack, one of the Dóchas members. The importance of public engagement and more specifically around development education. Again, Louise, I know in Dóchas we've been working a lot on this. I don't know if that's something that you would like to comment on, just how important that is and what plans or some kind of ideas to bring the public along with us.
Yeah, I think it's something we've discussed for quite some time across the Dóchas network, and I think we're really beginning to understand now how much we need to bring the Irish public with us, and how much we need to try and translate those complex situations into very real lived experiences. So I think our panelists here today are helping us do that. I think that's, you know, one of the first steps is really hearing stories from overseas, from the ground, from what's happening, and making that connection. And I think making the connection between cause and effect, I think global citizenship, development education, or communications should all be tied in together, and that's something that we're looking to do within Dóchas. We have we're embarking on longitudinal research around public attitudes to aid, and that will kick off this year, and it will go on for a number of years, and we hope it will, you know, help us understand how better to engage. But I think there's an appetite generally globally in Ireland to be honest, to talk about what we've seen overseas, to bring in voices from the global south, to bring in voices from the Middle East, and to really talk about how effective the work we do overseas is. But the reality is we do need to address structural issues as well to really get to really solve some of these issues which we haven't been able to. But I think we're doing our best to try and bring all those conversations together. And today's webinar, I think, is one piece of the puzzle. So please watch this space, I would say to everybody, and engage and have those conversations, and share the video, share the pieces that we can all talk about together.
Thanks for that, Louise. Now, Barry, in a few minutes, I'm going to come to you. A couple of questions there around the EU, putting you on the spot there. But before I do that, maybe over to you, Maeve, a little bit more. I mean, it's been strange, hasn't it, that all these our normal multilateral meetings have all either been cancelled or gone online. In some ways, that can be an opportunity. Like today, we can get more people, but for others, it really does affect how we can negotiate and make the changes changes that we need in some of these kind of big multilateral decisions like the SDGs, but also, as you say, around debt cancellation. How do you feel it has affected things like these World Bank meetings and all the rest? And as Irish civil society, or even Irish politicians here, what more can we do to kind of influence or be part of that virtual conversation?
It has been a struggle, actually, and there's been a bit of dissatisfaction. I think that there have been moves made to the annual meetings that are coming up in October, are basically planning on, there would be a lot of a huge civil society kind of meetings, side meetings, events that people will come to. And I think there is a sense of kind of dissatisfaction in some of the alternatives that are being put forward. But I think for us, I mean, the main thing really, like, we can all kind of talk amongst ourselves in our networks. It's really kind of opportunities to talk to some of the politicians in the room, and to kind of get them to raise up the issues and to engage. I do think Ireland tends to have a strong voice on these matters and a respected voice, and there's a lot of space that we have there. I think to go back actually to the point, the question Mela just had about development education. So we are very active in our development education work. We have resources that include sovereign debt, targeting junior cert maths, leaving cert politics. We have adult and community education work at all levels. And I think one of the biggest obstacles we find is people assume that these are difficult concepts to understand. And I appreciate when you start talking about sovereign debt workout mechanisms and things like that, and that's at all levels, including politicians we've spoken to. But fundamentally, when we're dealing with kind of this level of structural inequality, and when we're dealing with the structural changes that need to take place, people are well able to understand, the concepts. It's just really having that space. And I think what we're hoping is that our political voices will try and elevate that kind of conversation up and have this conversation in those fora. Very quickly, if I can just respond to the reflection that Barry made about the kind of sustainable corporate governance. Just to note something I didn't talk about, we've noted and we've been told that one of the problems in the COVID response in some countries has been around existing public-private partnerships and the kind of contingent liabilities that countries have signed up for. So basically, deals that have been struck around private healthcare facilities and hospitals, and the government has to pay. And so, for example, if certain forms of healthcare is being suspended due to the pandemic, in the way that it is here, elective surgery being cancelled, things like that. And there's been a real concern about the impact that this is having. And one of the asks that we actually have has been around basically trying to suspend debt conditionalities that require the privatization of healthcare services in the global south, and sort of a response to this. And I think that stronger regulations around the private sector will be incredibly welcome, and kind of putting another kind of pressure on that way. But that's just replying to that. Thanks, Suzanne.
Thanks, Maeve. Look, we are running out of time a little bit, so just one thing on the chat, and thank you from Brian Ledden there. Really kind of making this great suggestion that every committee should be looking at the SDGs and how it's going to contribute to the SDGs. I think that's a great idea, and I know in Dóchas we really need to energise our work and commitment to the SDGs, and that's what we need to do in the next while. It's interesting, isn't it, that the stakeholder forum was due to be held this week on the 24th on migration, absolutely timely, but unfortunately it's been cancelled or delayed, so we need to make sure that gets going again and works well. But to a final set of questions, and Barry, we're going to put you on the spot, I'm afraid, very much around the European Union. So first one there from Niamh Garvey from Trócaire, talking about what progress is being made on the EU brief, particularly in terms of that instrument around protection of human rights defenders. There are also a couple of questions in there, one from Goal and the Irish rule of law, and really asking that question, what more can we be doing in Dóchas to engage at the European Union level, given that there's some vital negotiations and conversations going on, yes, around the MFF, which will directly impact on funding to Irish NGOs. So I don't know, in the few minutes we have left, if you want to comment on yeah, what's going on at the
yeah, I'll gallop through it very quickly. On the due diligence issue, that is it's predicted to go to a legislative instrument, which is really, really interesting. And I'll just start by introducing, she's not on the, well, she is on the call, but is Claire Gray, who's my assistant in this. And I would encourage those of you on the call who would like to plug into all of this to reach out to Claire, who's helping me on the development side. As to Neil, hello Neil, nice to hear from you. You know, I think in terms of the access to EU financing, I wonder, should Dóchas get you guys to sit down and either open an office in Brussels or hire in, you know, collectively somebody here, because it is Byzantine, it is very difficult to understand sometimes the logic, but there's very little substitute for being here and on the ground. And I can see some of the NGOs coming together on the fundraising side, but you know, at the institutional fundraising side, there probably is a little bit of rationalization would benefit there. In terms of future opportunities, Neil, you were asking, I mean, I think, you know, I mentioned about this gap of 2.3 trillion for the Agenda 2030. You know, I'm looking at blended finance. We've had a report to the Development Committee on blended finance, and there's a huge amount of skepticism in the NGO community, but I want to look at it again. I've asked the committee if they will engage the private sector to look at this issue, because it is the only bridge right now, having, you know, reflecting on the other financing issues that are falling down, on the debt conditionality in relation to private health provision. You know, I have been looking at that issue. It comes up and I've been briefed on it in the last while, and it's impossible to have a single rule on this because of the, you know, there's a lot of countries where there is no effective public health system, you know, and experience of Sierra Leone during the Ebola outbreak, there's very little in the way of public health in terms of GPs, in terms of access to ICUs, etc. So, you know, a one-size-fits-all solution isn't available there. Suzanne, I'm conscious I'm galloping because I just wanted to say at the beginning that, you know, I'm interested in this area. We have a bit of a view on Brussels here, and I would like to take this forward a little bit. And I'm sure Frances Fitzgerald is exactly the same. She's also a substitute in this committee. You know, and over here, we MEPs, we do tend to work together, unlike over there.
Thanks very much, Brian, Barry, and I very much appreciate it. It needs a longer conversation, and it's certainly been on our list of things to do some more. It's interesting, isn't it? We had a great dialogue in January where I think we were all in the room. Little did we know that would be the last time we could all meet together. But look, I am going to have to draw this to a close. I know there was one other a question there from Trina on women and girls. We're going to have to leave that for another time. But as you know, Frances Fitzgerald, I think she listened in to a little bit, and she's been championing a lot on that, and appreciate that at the European level. But I think we will need to bring it to a close there, if that's okay. A very big thank you from me to all the panelists, but handing over now to Finola for a final remarks. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Suzanne, and thank you all so much. I think we've had a really rich discussion today, very vivid in terms of the imagery, and I think we went right from the big issues, the complexity of it all, down to individuals. And I think we'll all go away thinking of that young girl in South Sudan who said, "My world is over," and to some of your images, Colin, about 9-year-olds being married off, and many more besides. And I suppose that's what it's all about. I hope we'll all go away with a stronger sense of the challenges facing countries beyond Ireland, but also some of the opportunities. And I think the other thing that I took away from this afternoon was just the rich diversity of expertise right across, whether we're talking in embassies. You spoke, Colin, about Vincent O'Neill, who's a fantastic ambassador out there. We have wonderful MEPs, we have politicians who care about these issues, and we have a public who's always behind the aid budget. So I think we go away with hope today. And at our conference, we talked about our duty of hope and our duty of optimism. And we could all become absolutely burdened by COVID-19, but I think we need to lift ourselves up. There's only a few weeks until Budget Day, mid-October. I hope you all agree that it is really important to take on the responsibility that we all have to speak to that duty of optimism. And while the issues are complex, when we break it down and when we work together, we can rise to the challenge. So I want to thank all of you, and I'd also like to say it's the beginning of a conversation. And so we will work with the committee, we will work with all of you who are elected representatives, and we will work with the members to make sure that this remains live. And I spoke about Mike Ryan earlier, but last week he said, "We look to Ireland for leadership. It punches above its weight on the international scene, in multilateral diplomacy, on ODA and development in general." And I think that's the challenge to us. We are a small country, but we've huge influence and we have fantastic shared values. So you'll hear more from Dóchas on this, and we look forward to working with you all. And a very big thanks to all of you who came on the call, and a special thanks to all the speakers and panelists. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.